Hey, and we're happening with the Diversity Collective.
Oh, here we go. I'm unmuted. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Diversity Collective's very first discussion, Getting Diverse with Diversity. So we'll be doing a round of intros shortly, and hopefully we've got a number of us joining online so far. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Diversity Collective was formed following a discussion around some of the frustrations that we have within the industry, both from our individual lived experiences and also professionally as well. It came out of a conversation around our struggles with the approach of intersectionality and how we value that as something of incredible importance, but it's not necessarily being put into practice in the workplace, along with some other challenges around siloed approaches in diversity and inclusion strategies, particularly separating gender from COLD initiatives, people with disabilities, Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders, and people who are LGBTIQ as well. So this conversation really came about to bring together some of the most sort of fierce and impassioned minds from the industry. And it's a little bit different to your usual panel approach. Instead, what we'll be doing is kind of discussing this in the same way that we would as a group of women who have worked in the industry for a number of years, sharing our frustrations, sharing our excitements for the industry and what we think should be happening in the future as well. So this is the very first discussion that we'll be having as the Diversity Collective, and we hope that this will be the first of many discussions. So before I hand it over for introductions, I wanted to first and foremost acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation that I'm on in Sydney today, and I will ensure that our other panelists also acknowledge the owners of their land in their individual locations. And I wanted to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that if it weren't for the traditional owners of this land, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have this amazing land to work on. I think we have so much to learn from Indigenous people and so much more to give back as well. Okay, so introductions. I'll start briefly. So my name is Sarah McCarthy and I'm a diversity and inclusion practitioner. My areas of specialty and focus are LGBTI inclusion, particularly LGBTIQ women, and inclusive leadership as well. We also suggested that we might share one of our individual bugbears before we get started into our conversation today, which might act as a bit of an anchor for moving forward. So I certainly have one particular bugbear, and for me it's around organisations that might believe that they're inclusive in some ways, but in fact are far more accepting. So we'll talk about the difference between acceptance and inclusion later, but I think it's shifting between assuming that your practice is inclusive and actually asking the people who it impacts. So for me, that's one of my biggest challenges. And the other one as well is the lack of focus on leadership capability to lead people through change towards inclusive cultures. And I think we often leave that out of the question. And we often assume that once people have the understanding of what it's like for minority groups, then they will inevitably be able to create a more inclusive environment. And that's not always the case. So I'm going to hand it over to Christina for your introduction.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Christina Ryan and I'm the CEO of the Disability Leadership Institute. I founded the Institute almost 3 years ago when I realised that equality was what was missing for people with disabilities, and that was why not only were we experiencing such high levels of violence, but we really had no presence in leadership circles right across the board. And some of the things that have been really captivating my attention in recent times is there's a couple of things. One of them is the thorny issue of assimilation. Are we comfortable with diversity, with having people in the room, as long as they behave like us? And more recently, in the last couple of weeks, I've been tossing around a lot of thoughts around resilience, and I'm starting to develop some ideas that perhaps the leadership we've been talking about is actually able white men's leadership, because that's fundamentally who is in leadership positions, and that we've based what leadership looks like and how it needs to be based on that particular cohort of folk. And I'm just starting to get some really big thoughts about that, which are not dissimilar to the assimilation conversation. I'm really looking forward to tossing some ideas around today. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Christina. We might throw it over to you, Nareen.
Hi, Sarah. How are you? Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting this morning that I am on Gadigal land. I get to live and work on Gadigal land every day, which is just lovely for me because my Aboriginal family ties are to the inner city, and I identify as a member of the inner city community, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in Sydney. I'm actually Professor Nareen Young. I am Industry Professor of Indigenous Policy, open brackets, Indigenous Workforce Diversity here at University of Technology Indigenous Research and Education Centre, Jumbunna. As I said, I'd like to acknowledge that Jumbunna is here on Gadigal land. We honour the ownership and sovereignty, never ceded nature of this land in what we do here at Jumbunna every day. I'm very lucky to be now working around Indigenous workforce diversity specifically, and some intersections around that after working around workforce diversity as a workforce diversity practitioner for over 20 years, as CEO of Diversity Council Australia, and before that, Director of the New South Wales Working Women's Centre. So I've had lots of time to form my opinions on what might be my bugbears, and my major bugbear is, frankly, diversity practitioners and very middle class, educated, private school educated women, assuming that we're all the same, that women are all the same, that we're all like them, and that that is where we should be focusing our energy in terms of diversity practice. And where that goes to in terms of Indigenous people, it seems to me, is I've experienced for so long all the biases of Australia when it pertains to Indigenous people, particularly working in corporates, and that is around capability, diversity, place, role, and particularly what we're capable of in this society. So I think this is an absolutely fantastic initiative, and I'd like to thank Christina for all your work in getting it together, and I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you.
Thanks, Nareen. I think you draw some really interesting points around particularly some of the issues within the industry, but also some of the differences between sort of that third and fourth wave feminism and who feminism and diversity and inclusion initiatives are actually for. So I can't wait to hear more about your thoughts on that. Cecilia, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and hello, everyone. I'm coming to you from a meeting place today. I work at the section where the Wongal and the Gadigal people, both of the Eora Nation, traditionally used to meet, which is apt because we do a lot of meetings here, which is good. I am the director of a consultancy group called DiverseWorks. We specialise in diversity consulting, but our main specialty is in and with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. We're part of an overarching group called the Cultural Perspectives Group, which has been around for about 26 years now, I think. And my bugbears, I think I'm starting to mirror what some of the others have said. I've got three, break it down. My main bugbear is that I think we're at a point in diversity and inclusion that we're still seeing a lack of any structural change, and that is that impacts greatly, I think, on all of what I call the diversity cohorts: women, women of colour, women from migrant backgrounds, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, people from core communities, people with disability, LGBTIQ people. The structures that we exist in Australia were built to service a particular cohort of people, and it is not. They don't service the entire community and haven't done so. In fact, they were built to exclude sections of the community. So I think until we actually start to talk about and see structural change, we've gotten as far as we can. I agree with Nareen about the lack of diversity and inclusion expertise in Australia, and I think that there is a glass ceiling for people from particular backgrounds to actually be speaking and using their lived experience to actually influence, particularly in the corporate sector. And finally, I have a real issue with what I call the diversity pie, which is, I guess, a way of describing the siloing of different groups. And so particularly with government and the corporate sector, you'll get, well, this year or for the next 5 years, we're focusing on women, or we're focusing on women and Indigenous issues, therefore we can't do disability and we can't do CALD. We can't get to LGBTIQ for a little while. And I have a presentation where I say, talk about this, I say diversity, it's not a pie, guys. If you're dealing with one or putting some money over here, it doesn't mean you can't put money over here. And until we break down that internal fight within corporate and government budgets, again, we're not getting as far as we should.
Thanks, Cecilia. All right, and lastly, we have Felicity.
Hi, Sarah, and hi, everyone, and everyone that's joining us live. Absolute pleasure to be part of this group. To introduce myself, Felicity Menzies, CEO and founder of Include Empower, which is a full-service diversity inclusion consultancy based in Sydney. Bit of personal background, I became interested in the space really from spending a lot of time, I lived 10 years in Asia, and it was the first time that I led a culturally diverse team, and I served a client base which was multicultural, and I made a lot of mistakes, failed miserably, and I was unhappy, and I had to really examine some of my own biases. Took myself back to university, and through my learning about intergroup relations, some neurocognitive study, learning about implicit bias, learning about systemic racism, feminism, I then began to understand the world around me a little bit better and became a passionate advocate of diversity and started applying some of the techniques which I had learned through my studies in my real world, and found that it enriched my experiences, my professional life and my personal life greatly. So I carry that passion through to my work. My bugbears in the Australian market, there's two, giving this a lot of thought over the weekend, and what really frustrates me is the lack of authentic and sincere, genuine commitment to diversity and inclusion. I'm at the stage now where if I believe that a client is not prepared to put some serious money behind diversity inclusion and also to hold leaders to account on outcomes, I'll walk away from the job. I think both those two are needed. So lack of commitment frustrates me, and then a lack of courage frustrates me. I think some dimensions, if we want to call them that, some areas of diversity inclusion are easier for corporates to tackle because they're less uncomfortable areas. And I think that there are particular areas that touch on workplace taboos, whether that's religion, disability, or whether that's cultural diversity and ethnic background, Indigenous engagement, that I think that workplaces aren't brave in having those conversations that we really need to move forward.
Great, thanks, Felicity.
Thank you, Felicity. Right. And I'm just going to briefly interrupt there because Nareen acknowledged me at the beginning, and I want to acknowledge Sarah because, in fact, this is happening because Sarah and I had a conversation. So I'm just going to deflect half of my rosy glow towards Sarah because she does deserve it. I would also like to acknowledge that I'm on Ngunnawal land. I'm down in Canberra, and it is a very beautiful country. I do pay respects to elders past, present and emerging of the Ngunnawal people, and also acknowledge their incredible involvement in the local Canberra community and how much they have supported my work over the years. And I've had the honour to be involved with many of their activities as well. And it's an incredibly enriching place to live for that reason. Thank you, Sarah. I'll let you continue with the introductions.
Thanks, Christina. All right, team, let's get stuck in. So we've touched on a few key important points so far, and I'm sure there's many, many we could cover in the next 45 minutes. So let's dive straight in. Before we do that, I just wanted to make a quick note. I mentioned this earlier, that we all work professionally in this space, but we also all have our own lived experiences as well. So I wanted to kind of make a quick note that whilst I have experiences as a woman who's also a lesbian woman, I'm able-bodied, I'm white, and I'm cisgender. So from that perspective, I bring experiences to the table around my lived experience, and I hope to be the best ally I can for other communities, but always open to being educated and being schooled in those areas. So just kind of wanted to put that out there. So let's jump into intersectionality. It's such a big, juicy topic, but let's see if we can break it down a little bit. And I think we all have really kind of passionate views in this space. So for anyone who's not familiar with what that is, it references kind of an analytical framework that attempts to identify how interlocking systems of power impact those who are most marginalised in society. So it's looking at the intersection of a number of identities and analysing that point rather than the singular identities. So over to the group. Don't be shy. I know you won't. This is by no means a group of shy women. So why are we struggling to take an intersectional approach, and what can we do better?
I am going to jump straight in there and back me up, anybody. But one of the things that I had the enormous privilege of doing a couple of years ago was Westpac's Social Change Fellowship. And I
will always back you, Christina.
Thank you, Nareen. During my fellowship year, I chose to look at diversity structures, and I got round talking to all sorts of big corporates in Australia and public sectors. I have a very long history in the community sector in NGOs, so I didn't look too closely there because I had a fairly good understanding of what was happening. But something that happened to me during that conversation, those conversations over the course of a year, was very much like the recent Diverse-ish video. And if anybody hasn't seen it, they really must Google it and watch it. Everybody was concerned about disability. Everybody thought it was important. Nobody was doing anything about it. And it was shocking. And when I saw the Diverse-ish video, I thought it was a spoof of my fellowship year. It was that close to the mark. 94% of people think disability is important. Only 4% of companies are doing anything about it. And this is the heart of the problem with intersectionality, in my opinion, is that it's so siloed. We break everything down. And so I had people saying to me, oh, we're doing gender at the moment, Christina, we haven't got to disability yet. That was a quote that turned up in the film, so it's a real quote. People also said to me, oh, we just hadn't considered that disability and leadership go in the same sentence. There was not a single disability leadership program or pathway that I discovered anywhere. And that is a global issue. It is not actually just about Australia. So we're not looking at intersectionality. We're not recognising that I'm not just a woman, I'm also a woman with disability. And somehow the disability gets carved off. Well, hang on a minute. If you're concerned about gender and are concerned about getting me into your boardroom or into your executive team, shouldn't you be doing both? 20% of all women are disabled. Half of all disabled people are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. The intersectionality is quite profound. So you cannot be working with one diversity group unless you're working across all of them, in my opinion. But somehow we're not doing that.
Yeah.
I'd really like to reinforce that. I worked with corporates for a really long time, for 9 years at DCA, and I'm still working with some. And so I got an overview, I think, and it seems to me that gender is absolutely dominant, as it should be, given the numbers, but there is no consideration of what we might be within that. And I have to say my own identity is complex. I'm a late identifier as Aboriginal, as so many Aboriginal people are, given the stolen and lost generations, and our community is very diverse in terms of knowledge of culture and knowledge of community, and my community knowledge is very good because I've identified in community for a long time. But I think that I am also white and working class and cowled on one side, and I think so many of us are, and there is such little thought given to the intersections of identity. But also, Christina and it seems to me that what you've identified there in terms of disability is bias playing out, and it's a bit the same as indigeneity. There doesn't seem to be any cognizance that people with disability or people who are from Indigenous backgrounds, and I hazard a guess cowled as well, is capable of holding leadership positions. And in terms of LGBTIQ, Sarah, I'm so glad you're around and doing what you're doing. One of the reasons I founded Pride in Diversity with Stevie Clayton all those years ago when I was at DCA was that what I found as a feminist incredibly frustrating is that there seemed to me such a lack of visibility for lesbians in corporate and government world. And it seemed to me that everybody bought into gay male identity, particularly camp identity, and that was really acceptable, but there was so little visibility for lesbians. And as a long-term activist in the women's movement, that really did my head in, because I was so used to freedom of sexuality being a focus in the women's movement. And I was like, this is so different to the women's movement that I'm used to. So I think that the intersectionality piece goes to, I think, the lack of visibility of women over the last 5 or 10 years or so, the hijacking of the conversation about women and work by the conversation around women on boards, which is really about Anglo women.
For sure. If I can suggest, I think there's so many barriers that we can look at around intersectionality and why it's not happening in the contributors, and of which there are absolutely many, and really keen to hear Cecilia and Felicity's thoughts as well. Also keen to hear about how do we start to shift the dial, but how do we actually do it? So I think that phrase is used a lot. I'm sure none of us know the perfect answer to that question, but where have you seen it start to be done well? Where are tiny iotas of success, or how would you like to see it be done more? So how can we actually start to pick apart and deconstruct this approach and change the industry?
If I can jump in there, yeah, I just as a framework for what I'm about to say, I think intersectionality is obviously the best way to describe why so many people are not getting ahead, for want of a much better phrase. I think that there is a danger, though, in not having a collective response to issues of intersectionality, because I think that you do run the risk when everything gets drilled down to the individual story, the individual person, that you can start to lose the power of the collective and the ability to negotiate as a group against, what can be really overwhelming, white male middle class power structures. Where I have seen intersectionality working really well is in the multicultural and the ethno-specific community sector, where you'll find women from migrant backgrounds leading not just local community organisations, but large multi-million-dollar national organisations. Part of this, I think, is because it is the NGO sector, which is, women heavy. It's a pink collar industry, but that is where you will find ethnic women with disability chairing organisations. And I think that other parts of the NGO sector, corporates and government, could actually learn a lot in terms of how people who cover a number of the disability cohorts are actually stepping up into leadership positions, because I'm not seeing it at the same level and in the same numbers in other sectors.
And what a great example of sometimes corporates being able to learn from other industries, despite being probably more resource heavy in those spaces. Sometimes those other industries are able to pave the way. Felicity, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So many listening to all of your comments. my head's jumping around a little bit. But one thing that I think, you asked the question, what would be a possible solution? I'll start with the barrier, is I think that there really is, and it gets back to Christina, the diversity video, where people were stumbling to articulate what do they mean by inclusion. And I find there's a real lack of, I ask leaders when I go into an organisation to do a diagnostic, a little bit by stealth. I position the conversation as a business driver conversation, but I ask them, what does inclusion mean to you? And very few leaders can answer that in any sort of substance. And I think that they're thinking still in terms of diversity, which creates necessarily a siloed approach. And I find that when I can get leaders, give leaders a model of inclusion, which is a unifying model, that also includes their lived experiences and causes them to reflect on their experiences in a way that then they can connect to others, and that they can understand that they have sometimes been excluded and how damaging that was, and they're able to then transfer that to the experience of others. I get a much more unified response from leaders. They start to, their minds broaden, and they start to look across the group and think, who is being excluded here?
Thanks, Felicity. Interested in what you're thinking about this intersectionality space, Sarah.
Broadly or more specifically, Christina?
Well, either. I mean, is it is it a specific thing that we have to deal with as a single lump? Is intersectionality a specific lump thing, single thing, or is it something that you break down into threads? Where do you come at intersectionality from?
I think there's so many approaches to this, and I think this is one of the primary challenges that organisations have. The thought of intersectionality and a customised, bespoke approach to each individual staff member feels so overwhelming. But in actual fact, it's something that we already do. When we onboard people, when we look at leadership plans and progression plans and individual strengths and backgrounds and experiences, we already take a customised approach to the person who's in the majority. So for someone who might be, for example, white or able-bodied, perhaps male, perhaps straight, or even within the community, someone who has more privilege, we're more likely to do that naturally anyway. But I think when we think about taking that approach to minority groups, it feels scary, it feels overwhelming, because we don't understand. We don't understand these particular groups or what they bring to the table. So it's something that we're already doing, but it's shifting that mindset to working with people and understanding that, in fact, a lot of these experiences that they bring and a lot of the challenges that they face, particularly around oppression and stigma, have in fact resulted in so much resilience and grit and strength because of the amount of times they've had to get back up off the ground. And that is inevitably a skill set in itself. So I think if we can start to shift towards the perspective of still understanding that each diverse group brings its own individual and unique experiences and different kinds of oppression and stigma, and we would never be able to compare the struggles of each of those groups. I think if we can take that knowledge but still approach each individual person as we would someone who's in the majority. I don't know if that's making sense. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that feeds into something I've recently also been tossing around with. I was having a look at models that work when we're talking about getting greater disability involvement into a workforce. So I had a client that I was talking to about this, and it's interesting because the disability conversation always assumes that everyone's coming in at the entry level. There is no conversation about leadership in the disability space. It just doesn't exist. And we're just starting that conversation now with the establishment of the Institute. The conversation's just getting going. Something I discovered going back to examining gender was, how did we do this stuff with women? We've had a good 40 years to be looking at it. And one of the things that became clear was that when it comes to getting women into executive and board roles, we didn't think in terms of having women's advisory groups, which is what we do with all of these other minority groups. We didn't think in terms of having separate spaces and getting masses of women in at the entry level, hoping that they'd eventually trickle up in an organisation 20 years later, we might have some leadership going on. What started happening, and it was some of the big corporates internationally that started doing it, was recognising that they couldn't be selling their products to women unless they actually had women in the boardroom and the executive suite helping them to understand women. So suddenly all these blokes realised they were selling to a market they didn't quite connect with, and they shipped women in. Now, let's just admit we've still got a long way to go. We're not there yet. But if that's possible with women, how is it not possible with other groups? If we're shipping in women, can't we be shipping in other people at those senior levels? And I'm going to ask you, Nareen, because you were headhunted and moved across right at the senior level to one of the big corporates. So it's completely possible for this to happen. It can be done when people set a mind to it. But the thing that interests me most about that, and the thing that I've developed a view on, is that once you've got leadership going on, that's where your culture shift starts to happen. That's where assimilation does get thrown out the window, and you're able to have people operating as themselves instead of coming in and trying to be the regular other folk, able white-bodied actually, that are already there. So how did that work for you, Nareen, and how did that support other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in that workforce to be themselves within that zone?
Well, that was a really interesting experience, Christina. I think what you're talking about is, in terms of pathways to success, are the separating out of two things. One is leadership in terms of diversity practice, and one is the day-to-day, right? And that goes to wages and conditions, most importantly. And some of that with leadership goes to the same thing, and it goes to pay equity, right? So we've got a lot to talk about there. So we need to separate those two out, and how one can link to the other and how intertwined they are. I think leadership in workplaces goes from right down on the floor, and I think it goes to team leaders and pipelines. And I think one of the issues that you touched on was that the women were already there largely, and we didn't have to create the entry-level positions. The creation of entry-level programs has, in a way, around people with disability and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, has in a way led to the reinforcing of the bias, I think. So we need to be challenging that all the time. For example, in the Commonwealth public sector, there's a few Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at a very few, tiny, minuscule number comparatively at the senior level, but the rest, everybody across the public sectors, which is where this is the only place that this has been measured, are at the middle level, right? So you can't tell me that no black fella in the public service in Australia is capable of reaching leadership level. So clearly that's about the bias. So I think we need to start talking about it and confronting it and putting it on the table more. I think one of the features of corporate life is that people don't talk about things, right? So everything gets, including incidents of overt racism and overt sexism and sexual harassment. It's why we're in all of these situations we're in now. And I've also been involved in the Me Too movement and around workplace sexual harassment. It's the conversation management that goes on. And so the groups like the one we're in today, and being able to put things on the table, because the membership-based diversity groups like DCA, like Pride in Diversity, are necessarily and rightly hamstrung by not wanting to offend their memberships, and that's how it should be. And Felicity touched on this too, the lack of conversation that goes on. So that's why I think groups where we're practitioners and we're a bit stepped back from it, but we understand the day-to-day of workplaces. And to me, that's the most important thing, because the leadership stuff trickles down into the day-to-day. Does that make sense?
Definitely. And you've touched on that ever important key point of leadership as well. And there's that middle kind of level of the middle managers that are the real power brokers in those situations, that are often either unintentionally excluded or not specifically catered to in those initiatives. And they are the ones that can make this change in a lot of those circumstances.
Well, that's right. And in terms of gender practice, which I worked in exclusively for many years, we always said it was middle management and line management that the attitudes had to change. And I think that is still the case. And we really need to be able to say it.
I'm interested in your view on this one, Cec.
I think I absolutely agree. And I know Nareen and I have done work together where we've had to convince, I won't name which state government, but convince state government that we have to talk about racism if we're talking about Aboriginal retention in the public service. And that goes the same for called employees as well. Retention is an issue, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Privately, they will say to you that it is because of racism in the workforce, but they're not asked at exit interviews explicitly if this has been an issue, and will almost never raise it. Until we call out sexism and racism in the workforce, let me backtrack. Unless there's an acknowledgement from power structures that there is racism, sexism, homophobia in the workforce, we aren't going to be able to get to the point where we're talking structural change. And I think that whatever we say, we talk about in terms of intersectionality, the end point is that what we are talking about is the giving up of power from one group to transfer at least some of that power to another group. And that is the baseline. I don't, to be honest, know how we get there. We've had 40 years of women in the workforce, women slowly entering positions of power, and that has taken 40 years. I don't particularly want to see another 40 years where kids from refugee backgrounds or kids from Aboriginal communities are still waiting to see their own people in large numbers in leadership roles, because you can't be what you can't see. And I think that's really, really important. But I still think we get to, it's a transition of power. And that is something that nations have gone to war over. So if anybody has any ideas on a peaceful, easy transition of at least some power, I'd be really interested to hear.
I'm going to come in. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm coming in there because something that has really occurred to me over a long period of time with structures, because I've worked for a long time in the disability community and in the last decade specifically in disability-based organisations. And one of the things we knew was that the structure of the system is based on disabled people going to the system and kicking up, actually using it, engaging with it, kicking up a stink if it doesn't work. We're seeing a lot of that right now with the NDIS. It's up to us to go to the system and to talk to it rather than it coming to us. And I think something lies in that concept of the system going to the people. And it's particularly the case in the disability community. If you want to engage with people with disabilities, you have to go to us, come to them. You can't expect disabled people, particularly people who are marginalised, highly marginalised, either through lack of work, and half of us don't work. That's because we can't get jobs. It's not because we're not able to work. Either through marginalisation or through prejudice, the system expects people to go to it. Now, this is part of this assimilation dilemma. Unless people start going to the people that they want to speak to, instead of hoping that they can continue business as usual and the world will come to them, we're not going to shift culture, I reckon. So there is something around how people are genuinely, and this is where Felicity talked at the beginning about having real commitment and putting some resources into it. Unless that commitment is there to go to people and to understand how they think and how they operate and the way that they are going to be best involved in something, we're not going to shift this conversation. It actually applies to work as well. And I've said this to executives when they've asked me about getting leadership happening at for people with disabilities. What's in it for me? Why do I want to come and work for you? I mean, I'm using me as an example. Of course, I'm not particularly wanting to work for them, but I'm going to be bullied at twice the rate of other workers. I'm going to spend my entire time pretending I haven't got a disability, even though I do. And I'm going to actually end up leaving. It's a high-risk thing to come and work for you because I'm more likely to leave within 12 months than any other employee because, and this was one on Cecilia's list that didn't turn up, ableism. The assumption that I should operate as a regular person is still there. So the system wants me to go to it. It won't restructure. And until we shift that paradigm, until we talk about who is interested and we have a two-way connection instead of it all being one way, then we're not going anywhere. So jobs are still being advertised the way they always were. They're not being advertised differently. Recruitment processes are done the same way, except in very small pockets where they're not. Until we shift some of those things, until we start operating in a way that is suiting the market we're trying to talk to, we're not going to get that market engaging with us as employees, as market, as general community. So I think there's something about the structure and the arrogance of the structure, the power base of the structure and how that's fixed.
I think as well, from people within the structures, there's a complete lack of understanding often about the power that they have. I do a workshop for public servants called How Government Policy Changed My Name. My family migrated here during the White Australia policy and got off the boat, grandparents, umpteen children and a couple of suitcases, no English, and couldn't get past the immigration officials at the bottom of the steps on the dock until they changed their names into English. And it's a bit of an eye-opener for a lot of people that a government policy actually has a direct effect on people. There's been some weird disconnect about the power that a public servant or a group of public servants can have in developing something on paper that actually has an ultimate outcome that affects people in their real lives. And it would be good to see public servants and people in government reminded of that on a regular basis. It would also be good. What's interesting, and this is something I was reading over the weekend, the people who come up to me after that workshop and say they love it are always people from migrant backgrounds. I've never had someone a public servant from an Anglo-Saxon background come up to me and give me the same response, which I always find really interesting. So whether that's because people just don't get it, actually just don't care, or they're a little embarrassed because they do get it and they haven't got it before, I don't know. But I don't think we're breaking down that nexus yet.
Can I put something out there as a way to go forward in terms of outcomes of this conversation? I'm sorry we haven't thrown to you, Felicity, but you might have a view on this. And I have a Cal background and a changed last name, an anglicised last name as well. And I was at a conference, lovely, and they might come on this next time, Welcoming Cities. Ali held this conference last week, who I'm out of the All Together Now movement. And I was saying how disconcerting it is to walk around with a last name that bears absolutely no resemblance to who you are, and how bizarre it is. And it's really one of the things that got me interested in diversity, because we're absolutely conscious of that as a family. Why, and here's my fundamental question, why don't they listen to us, Cess? And Sarah and Christina and Felicity might all have something to say on this. Why do the people with power, so Anglo communities, and I'd hasten to say I think we should examine the Irish component in that, in terms of Australian culture, because I have lived with an Irish Australian man for 30 years and he does listen. and he's the parent of 2 Aboriginal children and very much listens around that. So maybe something about being Irish Australian is different in that. That's my lived experience. Might not be the case for all of them. But certainly I know I've known Christina's family for a long time and they certainly listen. Why don't they listen to us?
I'll step in there. Is that okay? Look, many things that you've said, I think, help to answer this question. And Seth spoke about you can't be what you can't see. Totally agree. I also think that you can ignore what you can't see. And so I think that the marginalisation of certain groups, particular Indigenous, CALD, LGBTIQ, people with disabilities, out of the workforce. And we know that, for example, people with disabilities are one of the most marginalised groups. With them not being in the workforce and represented in the workforce, it's easy to actually not have the conversation. It's easy to ignore the problem. And I really like Christina's theme of how do we encourage corporates to come to those communities rather than those communities always knocking on the door. And I think part of the problem is, and I'm coming up against this in my work, when I will I'm engaged for a diversity inclusion strategy, and I say, have you considered your customers, your customer needs? And I get thrown back, oh, we're just going to start internally now. And I think, well, internally you're homogenous, so you're kind of missing the point here and you're excluding a big group. So perhaps one of the answers to this is we start actually encouraging corporates to think about, the externally, what does inclusion mean? And I know, there are some companies which are doing this phenomenally in terms of their product design, but just more broadly, because we are... every consumer has an intersectional part of their identity, and companies are ignoring that, I think. So that's one of my comments on this. And I agree that, it's ignorance. It's a bit of arrogance, and it's also ignorance.
I think there's also something about... Oh, sorry, Sarah. Keep going.
Sorry, we're just on the same vibe, Christina.
I think there's that continuing thing, and it is about the invisibility. If you're not in the room, you get forgotten in the conversation. We know that. When women first started getting into boardrooms, conversations sounded different. We know that. When women get into Parliament, conversations shifted. Now, we'd like them to have shifted more, and that still has to happen, but they've shifted. But when you're not in the room, the conversation doesn't suit you. And what does happen, though, is if you turn up, you're the other, you're the different person, and you're confronting. So what we have to do when we're from marginalised communities is tap very politely on the door. We have to be very polite about it. We can't be angry or enraged, because then we'll be asked to leave. We have to be so nice about being excluded and marginalised that it's actually a bit vomit-inducing. And then we have to be polite when we're in the room. But the other thing that we are required to do, and this is where diversity isn't happening and where assimilation cuts in, the thing we're required to do is make everybody else comfortable with our otherness, with our difference. And somehow that just seems to me, it's the arrogance of the power base. But there's something really weird in the fact that if you're never slightly uncomfortable, and we know that the best teams are the ones that have a slight edge all the time. They're the ones that are innovative. They're the ones that are going to produce the goods and operate faster. There's so much research about that, it's not funny. And yet everybody wants to be comfortable and not be confronted by the difference within their team. Why aren't we embracing it? Why aren't we actually going, wow, this diversity is really amazing. I can't get enough of it. How do I get more? Sarah, what have you got to say?
I think you're touching on such a key point, which we kind of keep skirting over through all of these conversations. It's almost that that frustration. Sorry, just sort of my dog's head there. It's just that frustration about why are we not being listened to? Why is this not happening? Why are people not coming to us to ask? And I think such a core component of that is the discomfort that comes with feeling like you don't know what to do. Or as Cess, I think you referred to, maybe acknowledging that you have had a role comes with that possibly avoiding it as a result. I think one of the key challenges in our industry, which in some ways makes it more difficult to do this, but gives us more of a clear direction, is there's often a lack of acknowledgement around what it takes for people to engage in this kind of work. And part of that means a real deep self-reflection into your privilege and your lens and what you bring to the world. And adding on to that, a capability to be able to change your actions as a result and feel comfortable in the discomfort. And I think if that's one step we can take towards success within some of these organizations, it's encouraging them. And I've been in these organizations, I've consulted to them, I get what it feels like on both sides. It's encouraging those organizations to, you know, if I can quote the ever fabulous Brene Brown, it's dare greatly, move into this space acknowledging that it won't be easy and it's hard and you'll have some pretty uncomfortable conversations, because equality doesn't come easily and it doesn't come pretty and it doesn't come nicely, and it takes some really difficult conversations with the people who've had those lived experiences. And sometimes that means reaching out and saying, we don't quite know what to do, but we know we're not doing well enough. Can you help us out? And that's a really hard thing to do.
But why should you give up why should you give up your power if you've got it? What's in it for the able white person in power? Why should they do this? What's the point? Cec?
I think it's about shifting the dialogue, and to be honest, I don't have an answer about how to do it, because it is about the person with the power giving at least some of that up. But it's shifting the discussion to acknowledge that the minority groups are not the problem. This is, in my spare time, I'm the non-Indigenous co-chair of Reconciliation New South Wales, and this is one of our mantras. We exist to talk to mainly non-Aboriginal people about Aboriginal issues, because Aboriginal people are not the problem. It's the other 97% of the population who need to shift their thinking and their mindsets for us to achieve genuine reconciliation. And that context is the same in a workplace, in a government sense. It's that women are not the problem in terms of the gender game. People with disability are not the problem in terms of lack of being able to get a job. It's that the workforce will not make themselves ready and continue to make themselves available. For LGBTIQ people, it is not their problem that large sections of the community remain homophobic or structures remain homophobic. It's about flipping the dialogue to understand that, and again, I get back to the structural discussion, flipping the dialogue to recognise that we're existing in systems and structures that were designed 200 years ago by wealthy white blokes who didn't want anyone else involved and actively excluded women, Aboriginal people most definitely, migrants. I don't even know that LGBTIQ were even on their radar at that point, or people with disability. So it's about it, just recognising the reality we're dealing with, that we're dealing with a world that wasn't designed for us and needs to change.
And your point as well, Felicity, around the customer service side, I think is really important as well, because as you referred to, Cec, there's the business case around inclusion, and there's also the humanistic element. But sometimes when we shift the perspective from what we're doing internally and what we expect to provide to our staff and shift it to the customers of our business, it very much sets that platform on fire. It very much makes it about, well, we need to do better because this is the people that fund our business essentially to survive. And I think that really kind of starts to shift the tone. And once again, how that's done in every business, I don't know. But I was lucky enough when I was at Pride in Diversity to manage the Pride in Health and Wellbeing program. And we actually set up a structure around that program to consider every touch point of service provision from a consumer's perspective, to look at how many touch points could possibly be inclusive or exclusive throughout that. And looking at how that can be best done alongside internal inclusion was really, really interesting, an interesting approach. And mindful that we're coming up to our sort of five-minute close. So really keen to hear from everyone in the group. What does this mean for us as an industry? What are our calls to action, I guess, for each other, but also the industry more broadly?
I'll start there and we can go around. I think there's some really interesting stuff in the power dynamic, but I do think the base level does sit with who is your customer, because your workforce is also part of your market in a way, in my view. And this is where design thinking comes in. I'm a big fan of design thinking. I know there are people who think it's all old hat. I wonder whether it's losing its fashion, because if you're an able white person, you're just going to get the same answers that you're already using. It's only when you start talking to different people that suddenly your design changes fundamentally. Suddenly your comfort zone is being challenged. My call to action for everyone is to get out there, to find something that really makes you feel a bit uncomfortable and confronted, and have a good sit down and think about why, and keep talking to that space. Go to the space. Don't expect the space to come to you. Otherwise, you're just going to stay the same way you already are. Nareen, what's your call to action?
I think very similar to you, and I particularly like, Christina, that you articulate the notion of the space coming to you, of the diversity business going to the minority space. That's a bit turned on its head with RAPS, because organisations want to engage with Aboriginal community organisations. The issue is on whose terms and what's the outcome for those Aboriginal community organisations. And the notion that's very hard to get through to white Australia of self-determination, and that you should be dealing with self-determinationist organisations. So I think that in all of the contexts, my call to action is listening. There is this Aboriginal concept called deep listening, which we've used, and Cess has been around it too, in design thinking and in co-design environments. I'm also a fan of design thinking and co-design, Christina, and I think I am, and I know, yes, now it's going out of fashion, when this time 3 years ago it was the latest thing, but the point is that it does enable the groups themselves to have input in a way that doesn't often occur. But I think we need to be talking to organisations about listening to the diverse groups. It is just as important as it gets.
Felicity, what's your call to action?
Oh, Felicity, you're on mute.
Unmute myself. Rookie error. Sorry. No, I completely agree with Nareen. And I was reflecting as you were speaking, Nareen, about listening to marginalised groups, diverse talent. I have a client which I admire for appointing a senior level role called employee listening, which I just thought I'd never heard that before, and I thought that was phenomenal. My other call to action would be to just step up and be brave, take some courage and have some of these difficult conversations. One of the things that struck me when I came back from Asia and I started talking about cultural diversity was how uncomfortable everyone in the room was when I started talking about cultural diversity. And I would just pick up this sort of shifting of the seats and but we can't talk about race, you know, that would be, you know, and I think we need to realise that culturally diverse Australia want us to have these discussions, want white Australia to have these discussions. It's okay to have these discussions, and leaders need to be brave and make space for this in listening to happen.
Cecilia, what's your call to action?
I think it's twofold, and I agree with what everyone said, but I'd like to see some of these discussions happening within the diversity and inclusion sector as well, and some of that deep listening. I know Nareen said early on there's an overrepresentation of white middle class people. I actually think it's white middle class women taking diversity and inclusion roles because they've worked in the gender space and you know, validly so, but are not bringing a broader intersectional understanding, I think, to the roles they have. So I think that there's some room as a sector of our own to have the discussions internally. I also think that we need to, particularly when we're talking about workplace changes always keep a class lens on this as well. And this is something that's definitely playing out in the culturally and linguistically diverse communities, where we've seen in the past 20 years a shift to skilled visa intake into Australia. And for the first time in our migration history, we're taking university educated, highly experienced professionals who are entering the workforce at higher levels than previous migrants have been able to access. There is a glass ceiling issue, particularly for women of colour, but we can't forget the people who are not university educated. And it's part of the broadening divide, I think, in terms of socioeconomic status and benefits in Australia, where we're leaving people behind. And a lot of those people are going to be people of diverse backgrounds. And I think that we need to really keep that in mind wherever we go.
Thanks so much, Cecilia. We have run out of time this morning. This has been the Diversity Collective, our very first webcast. We don't know where we're going, but we know that we enjoyed it. The Diversity Collective featured myself, Christina Ryan, Sarah McCarthy, Felicity Menzies, Nareen Young and Cecilia Anthony. If you'd like to continue the conversation, you can join us on LinkedIn at the Diversity Collective group. Come and have a conversation, share ideas, share articles, and keep the conversation going about intersectionality, assimilation, power structures, and how we get diversity really happening. Thanks so much for being a part of what we've been doing, and we look forward to seeing you next time.